In World War II, there were many men who were monstrous, brutal, and savage. The Third Reich placed in command a number of evil people inside of occupied lands who would oversee huge deportations, executions, and they tortured the local population. Men such as Reinhard Heydrich became known as butchers for their actions, and one man who Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, championed as a Nazi hero inside of the Netherlands was Hanns Rauter. Rauter was a higher SS and police leader, the most senior SS commander inside of the Netherlands, and during the war he had 300,000 Dutchmen deported to slave labour camps, and 110,000 Dutch Jews were moved to the concentration camps, and most were killed inside of sites such as Auschwitz, within the gas chambers. Rauter was known for his terrible crimes, but like Heydrich, he was the subject of an assassination attempt, and Rauter was shot whilst travelling in his car. This was somewhat of a happy coincidence for the Dutch resistance, who were attempting to actually steal a food truck, but instead they had the most senior SS leader in their lands literally land in their laps. Rauter was not killed in the attack, he was very badly wounded, but what came following was horrific, as a huge number of reprisals were ordered, and this led to hundreds of people being executed and slaughtered. Today we look at the Rauter Reprisals. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Hanns Rauter arrived in the Netherlands following the surrender of the government and army to the Nazis, and he was appointed by Heinrich Himmler, the General Commissioner for Security and the higher SS police leader. He was the highest ranking SS commander in the country, and throughout the war he was responsible for many terrible crimes. He deported over 100,000 Dutch Jews to concentration camps, with only 6,000 of these surviving, with most being worked to death or gassed at sites such as Auschwitz. Also, he was involved in putting down the Dutch resistance, and Rauter would order scores of executions. He also, as mentioned, had 300,000 Dutch men deported to go and work inside of slave labour programs within Germany. When the resistance planned strikes, Rauter ordered brutal repercussions, and he had people executed and rounded up inside of prisons that he had set up. He terrorised the Dutch people, and many found themselves accused of being in defiance to the Nazi regime, and they were locked up inside of specific sites Rauter and his men had set up. He ordered the creation of the concentration camp of Herzogenbusch, and other camps such as Camp Voigt and Camp Amersfoort were made, and in these sites thousands of people were locked up, and hundreds were killed through the brutality of the guards or through the conditions they were kept in. He even created special sites of imprisonment and torture for political prisoners who were to be locked up indefinitely, and 738 men and 21 women were killed in these prison sites, or they were shot in the execution field nearby. Hanns Rauter was also a skilled commander, and he was in control of SS troops who repelled the Allies during Operation Market Garden in Arnhem. But being a senior SS commander who was known for his brutality, the resistance would target him for assassination. But he was struck down in a surprise attack that was not actually planned. On the evening of the 6th of March 1945 in Apeldoorn, the resistance discovered that there was a Wehrmacht convoy which was carrying 3,000 pounds of meat from a slaughterhouse to feed the German troops. They decided to attack the convoy and take it for the suffering Dutch people, and a group of resistance men were dressed in full SS uniforms, and they were planning to ambush the truck. It was a pitch-dark night, and the men were gathered near an embankment at the side of a road, waiting for the sound of a vehicle. They then heard a heavy car approaching, and they stepped out and stopped the car. But this was not the food truck. Inside the car were a number of German officers, and the resistance, who were armed, then began to shoot at the car, and the vehicle was littered with bullets. A firefight broke out, and more than 200 bullets were fired at the car and those inside. The driver was killed, as was Oberleutnant Exner, who was travelling in the back seat, their bodies riddled with bullets. The man next to the driver was still alive, and he was not recognised, but he was wearing his general's uniform, and he was injured, being struck with bullets. This man, of course, was Hanns Rauter. He had been shot twice in the lungs, being shot through the jaw, and also through the thigh. He was losing a lot of blood, but Rauter then played dead, and the resistance ran off. Hanns Rauter was then picked up the following morning, somehow still alive, and he was transferred to a nearby hospital and was operated upon. The SD then ordered an immediate investigation, and SD officers combed over the car and the local area looking for clues as to who committed the crime. But the Germans would carry out brutal reprisal attacks and executions for the attack upon Rauter, who was not killed. SS Brigade Führer Karl Eberhard Schöngarth was involved in carrying out the executions of resistance members, but also executed were the Todeskandidaten, groups of political prisoners who had been sentenced to death for minimal things. The Germans waited to execute these, waiting for the next attack upon one of their own men, and several SD commanders throughout the Netherlands were told to find 300 Todeskandidaten, the death candidates, and one SD commander, Willy Largs, found 59 men. On the 8th of March 1945, 53 of them were shot. Another 6 were shot at a fort in Utrecht, and further executions continued. 11 prisoners were shot at the Val Diepersvlakte, and then in Amersfoort there were 49 who were executed. At the scene of the attack upon Rauter, there were 117 people who were dragged to the place where Rauter's car was hit, and Nazi execution squads then executed these people. Prisoners had been sent in trucks there, and the firing squad was already waiting. They were taken in a trailer in groups of 20, and someone read out the reason for their execution, and all 20 were then gunned down, and then 5 minutes later, another group of 20 were brought out for their execution. Those men who were not immediately killed were then given a coup de grace gunshot to the head, finishing them off. But the terror continued. 150 Waffen-SS men and members of the Order Police laid out the bodies of 117 executed victims on the side of the road, and they reopened the road, and passers-by were forced to walk past the victims, and many were forced to walk past the bodies of the executed many times. In the afternoon of the 8th of March 1945, the SD ordered local police forces to bury bodies of those who were shot in a cemetery. These men were buried without identification in a 50-metre long mass grave. But then people a month later began to dig up and identify the victims, and as the region was liberated from Nazi control, the victims' bodies were dug up and identified, and the remains were then given a decent burial. Some characteristics of the victims and their clothing was recorded, and objects such as rings were stored and placed in numbered bags to be given to relatives. People tried to find their loved ones, and the 117 executed at the site of the attack were reburied in coffins at a nearby cemetery in 83 different graves. When relatives came forward, the coffins were exhumed and opened, and within months most of the bodies had been identified, but still today only 2 of the bodies in the cemetery have not been identified. In the years following the war, many bodies had been moved to different cemeteries and buried in family plots, but there are still some of those who were buried at the site of the shooting. There were at least 263 people who were killed in reprisal for the attack upon Hanns Rauter. To repeat the numbers, 117 political prisoners were shot at the site of the attack, 50 were shot at Camp Amersfoort, 40 were shot at The Hague and in Rotterdam, and there were others who were shot in different sites. There are also some accounts of a German soldier who allegedly refused to execute the Dutch men, who was actually shot himself during the reprisals as he refused to carry out the order. The thing here is that Hanns Rauter had not been killed, but there were terrible slaughterous actions carried out upon those who were targeted for punishment after they had been rounded up. Hanns Rauter would later be sentenced to death for his crimes during the Second World War, and he was shot by a firing squad in the sand dunes near to a prison where he had committed scores of crimes. Still today many of the people who were shot in reprisal lie inside of their graves, and there are a few who lie in the grave that they were initially placed following their shooting. It was a brutal reprisal which led to hundreds of people's deaths. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.